I received a case that seemed simple: an elderly man found alone in his home, with no apparent signs of violence or disturbance. But there was one tiny clue that no one else noticed, and that clue changed everything we thought we knew. My name is Andres Salgado. I am a forensic doctor, and I have dedicated more than 20 years to uncovering the hidden truth behind seemingly simple deaths. But none surprised me as much as this one. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. It was a gray afternoon in Buenos Aires when I was called to the deceased's residence, a 75-year-old man who lived alone in an apartment in the San Telmo neighborhood. Upon arrival, the scene seemed ordinary. Nothing out of place, no signs of struggle, no visible damage in the apartment. The body lay peacefully, as if time had stopped in that apartment. However, I knew that in every case, no matter how routine it seemed, the body and the surroundings speak. You just need to know how to listen. While the team collected samples and photographs of the scene, I noticed a small detail: a tiny shard of glass, almost transparent, resting on the carpet beside the bed. No one else had noticed it. It seemed insignificant, but something about it unsettled me. That shard did not come from any of the windows or from the usual glass I found on the nightstand. Moreover, its location was strange, as if someone had left it there unintentionally. It was precisely that small finding that began to reveal an unexpected truth, a truth that would change the course of the entire investigation. As the analysis progressed, I realized that this piece of glass was a key to understanding what had really happened to that man. And what I discovered taught me that even in seemingly simple deaths, the body and the environment always hide secrets. You just have to look closely. Join me in telling this story, where a clue no one saw coming let us unravel a mystery nobody expected. I received that case on a quiet afternoon, one of those days when it seems that nothing out of the ordinary will disrupt the monotonous rhythm of life one leads after so many years in the profession. An elderly man, a neighbor from the neighborhood, found in his home without visible signs of violence or struggle. At first, the suspicion was natural death, maybe a heart attack or a minor domestic accident. But when I arrived, something at the scene made me stop. It wasn't a premonition nor a vague hunch. It was a small, tiny detail that almost went unnoticed by everyone except someone who has spent years looking at what no one wants to see. The body was on the dining room floor, near the table, with the hands half open and a calm expression, almost as if he were asleep. There were no signs of struggle, wounds, or anything that would normally indicate some form of immediate violence. On the outside, everything pointed to a simple and silent end. However, my gaze settled on a small object to the right side of the corpse. It wasn't something that, at first glance, seemed significant. But there it was, on the floor, almost stuck to the carpet that covered part of the floor, a small metal button, rusted and with remnants of fabric that did not match any visible garment at the scene. I took that button with tweezers and carefully placed it in a bag. What seemed like a trivial element was, in fact, the first piece of a puzzle that no one had stopped to assemble. While waiting for the digital forensic experts and other specialists to arrive, I began to examine the rest of the surroundings. The house was impeccable, with no signs of forced entry, no objects out of place. It was as if time had stopped for a few minutes, and then death had ended everything without leaving visible traces. But that button made me think. Not many metal buttons remain today, and this one seemed from a uniform or an old formal garment. Perhaps a coat, a jacket. But the victim did not usually wear clothes with metal buttons. So the button inevitably suggested that there was someone else, someone who had been there, and about whom, until that moment, no one had spoken or even suspected. I then decided to do something that sometimes can seem a luxury in forensic routine, but that in moments like this becomes inevitable: to thoroughly review every detail, every inch of the scene. I went to the bedroom, the bathroom, the garden. There were no signs of intrusion, nor visible clues that someone had been acting against the flow. But what I also noticed was something curious. In the bedside table drawer, documents were scattered as if someone had searched for something hastily. A carefully folded paper, partially visible, showed an address that was not the victim's. I took that paper along with the button, keeping both as essential evidence. I believe that at that moment, I decided that this case was not as simple as it seemed. The preliminary autopsy report showed no signs of poisoning, internal blows, or ruptures that explained the sudden death. The heart, although it had signs of typical age-related problems, showed no recent damage. But there was something else. Small scratch marks on the right wrist, almost imperceptible, which at first glance seemed superficial, but upon closer examination I realized to be the result of a very brief and desperate struggle. That small sign was a trigger. Had I not seen the button, I would never have stopped to examine those marks. But both clues, the button and the injuries, led me to an inevitable conclusion. Someone had been with him, and there was physical contact. More than that, there was a subtle tension no one had expected. It was as if someone had tried something but had changed their mind, or at least wanted to appear so. I returned to the house 2 days later, with more equipment, including a specialist in biological traces. This time, we investigated the areas where the victim spent most of his time, especially the living room, kitchen, and small garden. It was there that we found another surprise, an almost invisible line of dispersed fingerprints, very faint to be seen with simple lights, but detectable with advanced chemical and optical techniques. The fingerprints were outside the usual pattern. They did not correspond to the victim or his close circle of relatives. I attached this information to the ongoing investigation. While we awaited results of the genetic analyses, I began to review the elderly man's history, a man with an apparently simple life, no known enemies, with old friendships and neighbors who spoke of him as kind and reserved. But the address found on that folded paper led me to another place, another story. I decided to go personally to that address, which was in a middle-class neighborhood, not far from where he lived. Upon arrival, the place was closed, but a neighbor told me that the person who lived there had moved a few weeks ago. A small detail, but indicative that maybe there was no direct answer to what I was investigating. However, people tend to leave traces, and in forensic biology, everything is evidence. In the following days, the investigation began to take a different path. The button was sent to a laboratory for more detailed analysis, searching for DNA traces or fibers that could be linked to some individual. And soon the surprising results appeared, an unknown genetic profile linked to the button, which did not match any relative or acquaintance of the victim. At first, that fact seemed more confusing than enlightening, but then I understood that the clue no one saw coming was just that, the invisible presence of someone else, someone who had been in contact with the victim at the key moment. That person was the missing piece of the puzzle. What followed was discreet surveillance, careful interviews with the social environment and family members. Little by little, a new image emerged, different from the one everyone had of that old man. A half-kept secret, a past he had subtly hidden for years, fearful that someone would discover it. Those nights when he said he went out for walks alone, those mysterious calls. Everything began to make sense. It was an especially cold night when I received an urgent call. A new clue had been found at the original scene of discovery, one that no one had detected until then because of darkness and humidity. A small mark, almost imperceptible, clearly left by a sharp object that had been hastily cleaned. The mark was on one of the interior doors. The lock was intact, but the door showed signs of having been forced from the inside. That sign shook everything I had believed until then about the cause of death. It could no longer be natural nor the fruit of chance. Someone had manipulated the scene, tried to erase traces, or at least disguise what had truly happened. And that someone had to be close, much closer than anyone had imagined. The fiber study on the button also revealed something curious. They came from an exclusive fabric, one of those materials used in high-quality uniforms, linked to an organization that until recently operated within the city's police circles. This opened a completely different range of hypotheses. The victim, knowingly or unknowingly, seemed to be entangled in something bigger, darker. And that is where the tension began to rise, because discovering that link meant uncovering layers upon layers of personal and professional stories intertwined in a knot impossible to unravel quickly. As I delved into that data, I remember the nights as a young forensic expert when every case was an absolute mystery, and every piece contributed to a truth that, although harsh, deserved to be told. This one would be no exception, but the difference was that now I was no longer just in the lab or morgue looking for technical answers. This time I held in my hand a reality with profound consequences. involving not only a death, but a hidden network of relationships, means, and motives. The button, the marks, the address, and the fingerprints were like the threads of a fabric whose complete image could only be seen if I never lost focus or patience. Every day, upon arriving at the scene, I would go over the place again, mentally reviewing every gesture, every forgotten movement, every tiny detail. It was like listening to a whisper coming from the shadows, signals that no one else had heard. Sometimes I wonder how a man who seemed so innocent could be involved in something so complex. And the answer always came to me with a mixture of sadness and respect. No one is only what they seem, and in death, the truth emerges with unavoidable cruelty, but also with millimetric care in every element left behind. I continued the investigation slowly but steadily, never losing sight of patience, because in cases like this, time is both an ally and a race against growing silence. The recognition of those marks, the identification of the unknown DNA, and a link to a network of people who operated on the edge of law and shadow began to clarify what seemed complete darkness at first. What no one saw coming was that the small button, almost trivial to most, was the tip of the iceberg. There was a story behind it, not just of death but of secrets kept in a sigh, in a glance, in an inexplicable absence. The elderly man, my silent patient, had been the guardian of something someone did not want to reveal. And that button, with its rust and valuable fabric, was a key that would open a door much deeper than anyone had imagined at the beginning. Thus, step by step, night after night, with exhaustion and concentration as my only companions, I immersed myself in the mystery that death had left as a hidden message. Because in bodies, as in old books, stories confess themselves, but only to those willing to listen patiently, without letting a detail, no matter how small, be lost to oblivion. That night, after leaving the scene for the last time, the images kept spinning in my head over and over again. I couldn't get that rusty button and its exclusive fabric out of my mind, the small marks on the victim's wrist, the apparently intact lock, but with that unlikely sign of force from the inside. Each element, taken alone, could have gone unnoticed, but together they formed a disturbing picture I couldn't turn my back on. I promised myself not to leave any loose ends, not to allow silence to bury the truth of this case. The next morning, I sat in front of a computer with a cup of coffee, ready to review every technical report in detail, to go over the interview recordings, and to trace every step the victim had taken in the days prior. Patience and perseverance were my best allies, while time seemed to stretch like an invisible thread that only I could pull a little tighter until I heard its vibration. The lab informed me quickly. The analysis of the button had found microscopic traces of a leather tissue protector used in clothing for police officers or high-ranking security personnel. It was further confirmation that this piece had been part of a uniform with history and background. The DNA it contained did not belong to the victim or his known surroundings. That person had been close at the time of death or had touched that button shortly before. With that information, I called in a criminal investigation specialist, someone with direct experience in security forces and corruption networks. I needed to understand the context, the invisible threads that connect people with double lives. Without much delay, I met a tough, meticulous man who listened intently to the story and nodded gravely. "This is not just another natural death case," he told me. "You have stepped on the ground that mixes more than a simple domestic accident. There are structures that don't forget, profiles hidden under layers of routine and silence." By the time I left that meeting, a slight weariness weighed on my shoulders, but also a flame of determination grew within me. The key was to understand what that person whose DNA appeared on the button was looking for. I immediately requested a list of retired and active security personnel, focusing on uniforms with that type of button, but also on background that might point to a connection with the victim. As the search escalated, data that seemed irrelevant before began to gain weight. The elderly man had sporadic visits from someone not appearing in family records, brief and recurring phone calls to an unknown number, and a couple of strange bank transactions shortly before his death. But the most shocking was an old photograph I found in one of the house drawers, carefully hidden under a botany book. In it, the victim posed alongside a young man dressed in that same uniform, smiling, but with a distance in his gaze that spoke louder than any word. That image disrupted all my previous hypotheses. What was their bond? Was there any pending debt A hidden commitment? As I mentally retraced the moment I found the button, replaying the scene with every detail, I remembered that the fingerprint line detected did not match that of the young man in the photo. So, who else had been there? The answer became an obsession. It wasn't just the death of a lonely man. It was a clash of intertwined stories, secrets perhaps buried for years. I decided to interview the nearest neighbors again, looking for any anomaly that might have gone unnoticed. Most remained convinced it was a natural death of that kind man who walked around the neighborhood with his dog, with no apparent problems. But a couple of neighbors, after some insistence, remembered a car parked several times on the street, with dark windows and no visible plates, that left quickly whenever someone appeared. That clue added more mystery. That vehicle was not in any official records and seemed part of an undercover operation or unauthorized surveillance. The air grew increasingly dense and heavy. The investigation began to open doors I hadn't expected and forced me to question the supposed simplicity of the case. At times, I felt I was facing an invisible wall, forces that preferred the truth to remain buried, perhaps to avoid greater consequences. Every advancement was an act of courage, but also an invitation to danger. Meanwhile, the study of the fabric fibers around the button showed something even more unsettling. Traces of an uncommon detergent mainly used in barracks and official facilities, reinforcing connection with security agencies. This was not the work of a casual visitor or a distant friend. There was a complex network, a web with unwritten rules and ties of loyalty and betrayal protecting secrets. With these certainties, I formed a new hypothesis, centered on the victim being a witness or unwilling participant in a dark event linked to these institutions. The death scene had been altered, not to hide an ordinary crime, but to erase evidence of a larger network. That detail made me shudder. It was clear someone else wanted to control the narrative. And in that struggle for control, the victim had lost a battle. One day, while reviewing footage from an old camera at a station near the neighborhood, I caught a blurry image of a man fitting the sought profile, entering the victim's house minutes before the estimated time of death. I couldn't see his face clearly, but his walk, tense, hurried, spoke of Russian fear. That shadowy figure broke the apparent calm surrounding everything. I decided I had to return to the house, this time accompanied by the fingerprint specialist. Patiently and under special lights, we searched the scene again, this time with expert eyes to detect the slightest sign. We found tiny particles of a mineral powder on the door frame where the sign of force was. That substance did not belong to the building or the garden. It was a material used in police control areas to mark people's passage or track movements, invisible to the naked eye, but detectable with specific equipment. Everything indicated the scene had been manipulated by someone with technical knowledge, with the intention of erasing or altering clues, but oddly leaving this trace that only an expert could discover. It was a macabre game between the one who wanted to hide and the one who had to discover. The analyses advanced, and with each result, the pressure increased. There was now a double game. To discover who that uniformed man was, who disappeared just after death, and to understand what secrets the elderly man had hidden in his last weeks of life. Meanwhile, the family and neighbors began to show more reluctance. Something had changed in the neighborhood's atmosphere. Evasive glances, avoided questions, uncomfortable silences when I mentioned aspects of the case. It was as if the town kept a tacit pact of silence to protect something or someone. Weighing that reaction against my own conclusions made me realize I was touching a sensitive nerve, that this case was no longer just about a death, but about an ecosystem of fear and power. One night, I received an anonymous call that accelerated the investigation. The voice, barely a whisper, warned me not to continue probing that path, to leave the case closed, because the price would be high if I persisted. I felt a chill run down my spine, but also a firm conviction that I couldn't turn back. That warning reflected the severity of the matter. At the morgue, while reviewing reports and notes, I faced the idea that this man might be the circumstantial victim of a much larger dispute, corruption, cover-ups, hidden alliances. Not only was the truth of his death at stake, but the silence of an entire system that preferred to keep those shadows where no one looked. Each morning, before entering the scene, I felt I was entering unknown territory, where every step had to be calculated but never stopped. The truth was chilling, But even more so was the possibility that those afraid of it could do anything to prevent it from coming to light. Digging into the uniform records, I found that the person linked belonged to a unit dissolved a few months ago due to internal complaints. That unit was dedicated to undercover operations, sometimes outside the law, and some members had disappeared without clear explanations. That clue led me to contact former agents who had deserted or been dismissed. Some spoke in whispers, others out of fear. But little by little, I built a profile of the man who had left that button, a former police officer, possibly involved in illegal practices, who had had some contact with the victim, and whose vanish trace indicated a hurried escape or a cover-up. I soon imagined their last meeting, probably a confrontation where the victim tried to do something that broke years of silence. Maybe he wanted to deliver evidence, maybe he wanted to speak, or simply protect himself. And someone else decided that this had to be silenced definitively, but with meticulous care to disguise the scene to appear natural. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, one thought persisted strongly in my mind. What did the victim know? And how had that small piece of metal, that rusty button, decided to tell me just that? Who was the man who was there that afternoon and tried to erase his presence, but left behind a trace invisible to hasty eyes? That tiny clue that no one saw coming, like a seed under the snow, had blossomed into a dark tangle. And although the night grew long and the path uncertain, I knew that with patience and attention, every whisper, every shadow, every forgotten detail would lead me to the truth. Because in the end, death does not only end a story, it also reveals others, often misunderstood, but always true to those who know how to listen. Returning to the house that night with a fingerprint specialist was not just a matter of procedure. I felt that every corner, every object, spoke of secrets that routine and habit wanted to bury. We walked slowly, carefully, illuminating with powerful but controlled flashlights, so as not to contaminate the scene. The temperature in the house felt cooler, as if time had shifted around that place. The dim light barely revealed the curtains moving gently with the windows slightly open, like a sigh. In the decade I had been doing this job, it was rare for a victim's house to feel alive after death. But this time it was different. There was something in the air that made me imagine the truth, though silent, was waiting to be discovered. As we examined surfaces, cracks in the walls, worn furniture, the specialist pointed out a small stain on the floor under the table that had previously gone unnoticed by all. It was an almost invisible trace, like a thin thread of dust that didn't fit the general dirt pattern. With high-tech equipment, we were able to discern that it consisted of microscopic particles of some kind of soil unrelated to the environment, but possibly linked to specific terrains used in tactical training. I instinctively remembered a conversation I had weeks earlier with a former security forces member. That mineral dust was used precisely to mark spaces during infiltration or tracking exercises. At that moment, my mind raced with possibilities. Had the victim been in contact with someone related to those trainings? Or had he been watched or even pursued? While reflecting on that finding, I received a call from one of the former agents I was in contact with. His voice, low and hesitant, brought information that made the lump in my throat nearly impossible to swallow. According to him, the unit to which the owner of the rusty button belonged had been involved in a clandestine operation that ended in a major scandal but was officially forgotten. It was a series of events where the lines between law and crime blurred, where ideals became impositions and corruption a hunger for power. That man in the photo with the victim was not a mere visitor or distant acquaintance. He was part of an old, almost ghostly structure that slips through the shadows of society. The weight of those words sank me, but at the same time pushed me to continue. I began searching for any trace that could connect the victim to that network. I reviewed archived police documents, listened to testimonies from former colleagues, and understood that the older man had made the most common and dangerous mistake: knowing too much. However, I was determined not to lose that thread. Even if the paths that opened grew darker, the feeling that someone was watching me became palpable. Every time I thought I'd uncovered an unquestionable truth, new layers appeared, new questions, new silences heavy with fear. One of the details that troubled me most was the family's reaction, which no longer seemed to trust me or the process. It was as if I had uprooted something deeply buried, and the consequences might extend beyond the victim's walls. The neighborhood, once peaceful and cooperative, now whispered cautiously, and furtive glances were exchanged when the dead man's name was mentioned. The sense of an invisible pact became evident. Something had broken, and not by chance. It was as if that man's death had awakened something within that community, a lurking fear or an unbreakable loyalty. I couldn't help but wonder, how far were they willing to go to protect that secret? Amid these doubts, I received another anonymous call. This time, the warning was even more concrete. Drop the case. It's not worth it. You'll end up in a place you won't come out of. A burning voice that offered no choice or explanation. I felt the icy breath of the threat brush the back of my neck. Yet a part of me refused to bow to fear. That warning was not just an alert. It was confirmation of the territory I had entered. There were too many interests, too many invisible hands trying to close the mystery to protect their own secrets. It was, without a doubt, a moment that marked the before and after. The case ceased to be a simple forensic investigation and became a silent battle against a network that resisted being revealed. I then decided to take a different route. If the official information was contaminated and the community closed off, I had to look at the margins. I contacted investigative journalists, hackers, and citizens unafraid to navigate the murky waters of hidden truths. From these contacts came revealing data. Suspicious movements in bank accounts linked to the victim, smudged documents mentioning contracts and secret meetings, cross-references with other disappearances and deaths in the same area. Everything seemed to be part of a mosaic fitting the hypothesis of a larger scheme, a network that rewrites rules for its own benefit. One night, while reviewing photos and videos again, I noticed a disturbing detail. An entire batch of security tapes from a public camera near the victim's home had disappeared, right around the dates before and after his death. That absence was no coincidence, but a selective erasure, a deliberate attempt to eliminate evidence. Who had the power and skill to do that without raising suspicion? Once again, the ghost of that disbanded unit reappeared, along with the certainty that the case touched a raw nerve of that corrupt system. That same night, when I closed the file where I kept all the information, I heard a faint noise at my apartment door. No one was there when I checked, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I only confirmed that I was in the right place and that the line between protection and danger had dissolved forever. Mornings grew harder and sleep became irregular, but the question I repeated each day served as a beacon. What was there between that dust stain, the rusty button, and the death of a man everyone wanted to forget? As the investigation progressed, I realized I was facing a wall of complicity, not only from those controlling official information, but also from those who, out of fear or interest, chose to remain silent. I understood that every death case, no matter how ordinary or simple it seemed, had secrets buried under layers of lies and omissions. And in this entanglement, the victim had not only been a victim of the final act, but a whole structure that violated laws and human integrity. That, however, did not stop me. Quite the opposite. It ignited an unstoppable flame within me. Aware of the danger, I decided to take a step that, though risky, could be the key to unraveling that dark knot. Confronting directly the people closest to that disappeared unit, those who still had something to lose, but perhaps something to gain by telling the truth. I connected with a former officer who, after much insistence, agreed to talk under condition of anonymity and full protection. His account was a gut punch. He told me about undercover illegal operations, disappearances, threats, and the use of innocent victims as pawns on a board where real powers moved the pieces from the shadows. He confirmed what I had suspected, but also broadened the scope. The victim had tried to become an uncomfortable witness, an unwitting guardian of secrets he should not have known. When that conversation ended, I felt the puzzle beginning to fit with terrifying clarity, though pieces were still missing. The plot revolved around a cover-up and corruption network where the line between friend and enemy was blurry, where silence was currency and life a sacrifice for a convenient lie. I knew the fight was just beginning, that making this public would unleash forces far stronger than I had imagined, but also that I could not let that story be lost. The last piece of evidence arrived when, after weeks of waiting, the laboratory confirmed that the DNA found on the button matched a missing ex-agent, officially declared dead months ago. That man had also been linked to a violent incident a few weeks before the victim's death. Knowing this was like holding the truth in its rawest, most dangerous form. The victim and his killer, if one could call him that, had been connected by invisible ties for a long time, and that relationship had claimed a life. That afternoon, as I left my office, I stared at the Buenos Aires sky, painted in orange and violet hues. The sun was hiding behind the buildings, as if the day itself wanted to conceal what the night would reveal. The tiny clue, the rusty button, the strange dust, the vanished fingerprints, had set in motion a path opening doors no one expected. That path was one way, and though the truth was painful, I had to follow it to the end. Because at the end of every death, there is a beginning waiting to be discovered, and I was willing to find it, step by step, no matter the cost. That night, when I turned off the last light in my office and stepped out onto the street, I felt as if the air was different, as if the silence had thickened around me. I had uncovered something far deeper than a simple autopsy could reveal, but that knowledge weighed heavily. Not because I was unfamiliar with the shadows, but because of the invisible monster I had awakened. Nevertheless, something inside me refused to retreat. The truth was not just a cold fact. It was a pulse, and I had to listen to it. The next day, I decided to start with the most basic, reconstructing the victim's last day with the few resources I had, because even with the whole web of conspiracies and fear, there was still a thread missing that tied everything together. Finding that thread meant unraveling the skein without making the air explode with lies or violence. So I sat down once more with the family, hoping that the passage of time would soften their resistance, although mistrust still lingered in their eyes. Beyond the evasions, I noticed small gaps in their stories, details that didn't fit the forced calmness of their words. It wasn't unusual. Those trapped in a secret know that the moment they speak, they might drop a bomb that turns reality into chaos. One of those moments stayed with me. The victim's youngest daughter, a young woman who used to sit at the edge of the bed, not knowing how to say what she had trapped inside, broke her silence with a whisper. Dad didn't want trouble, but he always felt like someone had been following him for months. That someone was not an abstract concept. Her eyes specified a shadow that haunted him, a pursuit that turned every step into paranoia. That confession, small as it seemed, painted a complete picture in my mind. A man who, without being at the center of power, had ended up trapped in its invisible disputes. The world we believed to be stable, with its certainties and clear boundaries, seemed to be crumbling under that invisible weight. I took detailed notes, scheduled strange visits, calls the family preferred not to answer. Then another disturbing question arose. Who else knew about that pursuit? I urged myself not to be overcome by the growing anxiety, because everything in those answers was woven with silence. The investigation became an exercise in patience and extreme vigilance, a path where every defeat could be fatal. The following days were a dance in the shadows, between interviews under the shadow of mistrust, calls that cut out inexplicably, and street meetings that seemed to be undercover surveillance. One night, as I was walking home, I heard a crunch behind me. I turned slowly and saw no one, only the yellowish lights of the street lamps and the distant echo of a city continuing indifferent in its routine. But that feeling had become a constant companion, that insistent whisper that there were eyes behind the curtain, invisible hands pushing from the shadows to keep the secret hidden. I decided to be even more cautious and took refuge in the digital world, where ghosts hide in data, accounts, and files. With the help of one hacker who had managed to earn some trust, we began tracking financial movements and digital communications linked to the victim and the mysterious unit of former agents. What emerged was as dark as it was predictable. Cash transfers from phantom accounts, service contracts without official records, exchanges of encrypted messages that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. It was a network that buried its traces under the same illegal snow covering those who were its key pieces. One day, while reviewing a set of leaked emails dated a few weeks before the victim's death, a curious subject caught my attention. An invitation to a clandestine meeting abruptly replaced by a cryptic message that read, "Reconsider movement." That message, out of context, would have gone unnoticed, but within the investigation frame, it was a bombshell. What did that reconsider movement mean? Was someone trying to stop an inevitable action that could expose the plot? I decided to go to a place where, according to old files and testimonies, members of that disbanded unit used to meet, a cafe on the city outskirts that served as an unofficial gathering point. The atmosphere was dense, and the strong coffee aroma seemed mixed with suspicion. I spoke with those who did not shy away from the memory, retired ex-agents who offered fragmented but revealing details. Every word, every silence, added to the image of a force that had become something much darker, where loyalty was sold to the highest bidder and human life was a pawn on the board. It was that same week when I received a message that shook everything I knew, an anonymous video with blurry images, taken from some hidden security camera, clearly showing the victim meeting publicly with the missing ex-agent. It was not a casual encounter. The tension was palpable in their gestures and the way they watched each other. That image changed the entire script. What seemed like an accident or an isolated act now took on a new dimension, a veiled confrontation, an attempt to settle scores or extend threats. However, the strongest blow came when, that same night, an anonymous envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside were a series of highly sensitive documents, internal reports, verbal orders, even mentions of a plan designed to eliminate problematic witnesses. The language was clear and brutal, but the data that shook everything was the victim's name on those lists, alongside dates and places. It was tangible evidence that what I was facing was far more dangerous and prepared than I had imagined. It was not just a crime of passion, or a common settling of scores, but a clear strategy to silence those who knew too much. Fear was not an option, but I also didn't feel alone. I knew that every step brought me closer to a precipice where the fall could be deadly, but the truth always had that power, to make the darkest shadows visible. That's why I strengthened my circle of trust, maintained constant conversations with brave journalists who had exposed corruption in previous years, and established a secure communication routine to stay in contact in case of emergency. One night, while reviewing recordings of calls and messages, I found a clue I had previously overlooked. A blurred conversation, seemingly insignificant, but when slowed down revealed a geographic coordinate. It was the address of an old warehouse on the city outskirts. Immediately, I decided I had to visit, even though my survival instinct warned me it wasn't wise. Intuition, that sixth sense sharpened by experience, told me there was something there I needed to discover to understand the whole picture. Upon arrival, the place was deserted, covered by the shadow of night and the wind moving papers and debris. However, it was evident that someone had been there recently. I found remnants of burnt paper, fresh footprints, and a strong smell of gasoline filling the air. The beam of my flashlight illuminated a small wireless receiver hidden under a bench, probably used to capture conversations or movements. There was no doubt. The network extended farther than anyone could imagine. As I left, I felt a presence, a vague whisper that could have been the wind or the certainty that I was being watched. Paranoia was no longer an idea, but a constant companion. Despite this, every advance gave me strength because I knew I was providing crucial pieces so that the truth, that tiny truth nobody had seen coming, could finally become visible. Days later, with all the evidence in hand, I would call a meeting that would change the course of the investigation, not with official police authorities, as many were too compromised, but with those who still believed that the weight of justice should lean toward the light, not corruption. I would share every detail, every finding, every piece of the puzzle that seemed impossible to assemble in a system designed to hide it. The bomb was about to explode, and although I did not know the consequences, I understood that this was the moment when the truth began to break its chains. I never imagined that a simple dust stain and a rusty button would lead me to uncover a network where justice and power intertwined so lethally. But now I knew. In an invisible world crossing our streets, where power disguises itself as routine, every detail, no matter how small, has the power to trigger redemption or destruction. The story does not end here, and neither will I, because, ultimately, that is the legacy of a forensic expert. To hear the silent voice of those who can no longer speak and bring their story to the day. And if the path grows darker, there will always be one last truth waiting on the other side of the shadow. As I walked away from the warehouse, the silence of the street seemed to dissolve into a constant whisper, as if the night itself were breathing with anticipation. Each step carried an invisible weight, a mixture of adrenaline and caution that kept my mind alert, but also, somehow, sharper. I knew that what I had just found was not merely circumstantial evidence, but the tip of an iceberg threatening to sink much more than the reputation of a few. That was what was at stake, much more than a man's life or family secrets. It was the deep web in which power intertwined with impunity, disguised as routine and normality. Hours passed, and my thoughts relentlessly revolved around that small wireless receiver, which seemed innocent but was key to understanding how that hidden network operated. Who had placed it there? Who was listening to whom? Those persistent mysteries pushed me to review the numbers, dates, and testimonies again, searching for a pattern that could make sense of that covert surveillance. Suddenly, a detail made me stop. A series of outgoing calls synchronized with the victim's movements, but disappearing from the record just before his meetings with certain people. That deliberate manipulation opened a door that had remained closed until then. The work with the hacker bore fruit. After hours of digging through a tangle of encrypted data, we managed to recover fragments of initially irrelevant audio. But with a small breakthrough, we pieced together phrases and key words. I could hardly believe it when a deep, calculating voice clearly mentioned dates, places, references to the plan and the intervention, all wrapped in a tone mixing threat with professional coldness. It was as if I were eavesdropping on a conversation that should never have been aired, the invisible conversation that had been directing everything from the shadows. But an even more unsettling twist emerged when I verified that the phone linked to those conversations not only sent and received messages, but was also connected to a broader network. A network that, only a few months ago, included retired and active officers and, more alarmingly, had internal complaints filed and silenced related to influence peddling and covert violence. The victim, that man who had seemed a mere bystander in recent months, was choreographically involved in that dark circuit, perhaps not as a protagonist, but as a key piece or uncomfortable witness. It was inevitable to think of the youngest daughter, her eyes full of fear, recalling her words about the constant persecution her father felt. I knew that behind that fear was something more tangible, a direct threat that had run like a murderous shadow until reaching the early morning when her father was found. How many others knew the truth, and who was willing to hide it at any cost? The uncertainty consumed me, but certainty grew with every fact. In that secret, there was no room for error or compassion. I then decided to take a risk I had so far avoided. I contacted a former agent who had participated in a little-known parallel investigation, someone who had deserted not only the force, but, apparently, the very reality he lived in. Timidly, he agreed to meet me in a little-traveled park, away from prying eyes. When he sat across from me, his eyes were a map of fatigue and distrust. He didn't need much coaxing to start speaking in a low voice, but with chilling clarity. He told me about undercover operations initially tasked with controlling disinformation, but which had begun targeting inconvenient voices, witnesses who, like the victim, knew too many secrets. The evolution of those operations had taken a point of no return where the end justified methods without question, and human life became a mere obstacle. It was not just a settling of scores or a personal revenge, but an organized system to preserve a corrupt order disguised as legality and national protection. His story confirmed that the cryptic message "Reconsider Movement" was not a random invitation, but an order to reward or eliminate someone threatening to dismantle that perfectly calculated network. When I showed him the video of the encounter between the victim and the disappeared ex-agent, he reacted with a mixture of surprise and resignation. "That didn't end well," he said hoarsely, making it clear that the visible tension in those images was the prelude to something worse. The implication hit me hard. The conspiracy spanned far more than a single death, and the ultimate prize for those behind it was eternal silence imposed on anyone daring to challenge their power. However, despite that harshness, I also detected a glimmer of hope in his words. He spoke of some colleagues who had not yet sold out, officers who shared anguish over the direction things had taken, and were willing to collaborate, albeit secretly, to uncover the truth. That network of honest complicity, small as it was, meant not all was lost. The days following that meeting were a tense mix of advances and setbacks. Distrust around me became palpable, not only in strangers' glances, but even in old colleagues pretending ignorance. Pressure mounted, and there were nights when the sound of footsteps near my house kept me awake, where merely checking messages or calls became an exercise filled with fear, but also tenacity. My circle of trust, though small, grew stronger, and we planned strategies to protect the most sensitive information, aware that at any moment the swift and brutal response of those who still believed themselves untouchable could come. At a critical moment, I received a forgotten message among many old email chains that chillingly summed up the essence of the conflict. None of this fails. Loyalty is bought and sold, but once broken, everything burns. That phrase ignited in me the perception that we were in a power game far more dangerous than the victim and his family could imagine. His death was not the conclusion, but just another piece on a board where many pawns and higher pieces move with intentions that could not and should not be allowed to disappear. Amid all this complex reality, I found myself forced to question not only what I had found, but what I could do with that knowledge. The truth, so elusive and intricate, weighed on my conscience. The call for justice was there, but so was the personal cost of traveling a path full of invisible dangers. I knew, however, that caught in that tangle was a final act, a last move that could unravel everything if I managed to fit the remaining pieces together. That is why I consolidated all the information and prepared a report that would leave no room for doubts or interpretations. I did not seek merely to present a case, but to offer a faithful and raw portrait, with names, dates, and evidence confirming the existence of a well-oiled machine dedicated to trampling lives under the guise of higher causes. I sent it to trusted people, journalists, human rights defenders, even some incorruptible judges, with clear instructions that nothing be leaked or anyone involved until we were ready to expose everything. From that moment, each day brought a mixture of hope and threat. The line between fear and commitment blurs when you know the only option is to move forward. The darkness I awakened with that simple rusty button, and the dust stain was now more than ever around me. But we were also closer to making the invisible visible. The truth is rarely comfortable, and its consequences can be unpredictable. But hearing the voices of those bodies that can no longer speak is a duty I cannot and will not evade. I never saw the night the same way after that investigation, as if the city held a secret that its streets whispered only to those who dared to listen. And although I do not know what will come, I know that tiny voice no one saw arrive is there, beating strongly, reminding us that silence and lies only rule while we let them. And I, as long as I have strength, will be the one to tell those stories, with every detail silenced by those no longer here, because sometimes an invisible thread is the beginning of unraveling the darkest fabric. The story does not end here. It is only beginning to reveal its true face. The following days became a silent battle, a tug-of-war between what I wanted to discover and what I sensed it might cost me. I knew I was playing with fire, but I had crossed a point of no return. Stepping back meant leaving everything in the dark, allowing those invisible networks to keep operating without further consequences. However, with each step I took, I felt the cold breath of those who did not want the truth to come to light growing closer. There were moments when astonishment gave way to deep exhaustion, because understanding just how far power can corrupt and abuse is sometimes an unbearable burden. But the certainty that this man had not died in vain kept my compass steady. As I delved deeper into the recovered files and conversations, something caught my attention more and more. The victim, beyond being an uncomfortable witness or a decorative piece on that dark chessboard, had tried for months to leave a trail. Not just any trail, but a kind of hidden signal for those who knew how to read it. His medical record showed strange episodes, minimal marks, signs of severe stress, and veiled threats that were never formally reported. He had written in his personal journals phrases mixed with codes and references that at first glance seemed disconnected, but when combined with the information from the wireless receiver and the reconstructed audios, form an elaborate message, a coded call for help that no one dared understand or even seek. That was what bodies and objects did when someone was filled with both fear and hope. Speak in a coded language, as small as a speck of dust that I initially failed to appreciate. It was a woman, a colleague from the prosecutor's office who still retained her honesty intact, who urged me to go beyond the papers and to search in the real territory, in the streets and faces that went unnoticed. Together, we visited places that seemed absurd from the file, like a closed cafe now used as storage, a small repair shop hastily demolished, and a neighborhood where neighbors whispered but also feared. There, amid their half-voiced stories, a name appeared repeatedly, a figure so intimately linked to the victim that his shadow extended to the darkest corners of the city. That person, whose identity I would prefer to omit, had the power to make any uncomfortable question disappear, and at the same time, an enigmatic connection with the victims of that network. That revelation increased the pressure on my shoulders, but also multiplied the need to find allies. It was neither possible nor safe to act alone, and although the temptation to shut everything down and turn off the lights was great, I decided to build, step by step, a fortress with those who still wanted to believe in justice. Among them were brave journalists willing to publish without filters, human rights activists with international contacts, young judges beginning to challenge orders received, and above all, ordinary people who, with fear and hope, approached to offer information or refuge. This human mosaic served as a protective network and a platform to make the truth at least visible, even before institutions recognized the problem. However, with every door open, I also noticed how others closed faster, how glances became evasive, how a whisper on the street could signal that my movements were being monitored. One night, while reviewing documents alone in my office, I heard the faint creak of the front door hinges. My heart stopped for a moment. It wasn't paranoia. The reality was that days of tranquility were behind me. Still, I refused to be defeated. I thought of the victim's youngest daughter, her eyes full of fear, and the unspoken promise to give her father's story a dignified closure. From that moment on, I used every resource at my disposal to protect the most delicate information. I kept encrypted copies distributed among several contacts, used secure channels for communications, and made sure every meeting was carefully planned. I also began to notice the duality of that web. While some people were willing to hide the truth, others within sought a crack through which light could filter. They operated in the shadows, with the subtle timing of those who know that small moves are enough to change the game, but also aware that the slightest mistake could be lethal. In this context, the ex-agent who provided me with crucial information reappeared, this time insisting on a quick and discreet meeting. He brought with him a police file and some more recent recordings. What they revealed was even more worrying, a plan to discredit key witnesses, with tactics ranging from digital manipulation to direct threats. They are ready to act, he said with a tense voice, and they increasingly fear losing control. That meant that I and my allies were targets in a dangerous game, where the plausibility of justice depended on our skill in interpreting every signal and action. The information we gathered led us to a clandestine meeting in a forgotten basement downtown. There, in front of a small group of committed people, I shared the most compelling evidence and the most alarming findings. The tension was palpable because we were aware that night could be a turning point. We discussed strategies and possible repercussions, but there also emerged a collective strength that seemed capable of breaking the cycle of silence imposed for years. That meeting, like a beacon in the dark, confirmed that the sum of wills was the only viable weapon against a machinery that intended to crush the truth. The revelation work we undertook with selected journalists required precision, context, and timing. The publication had to be impactful, but also irrefutable. To that end, we coordinated multiple fronts: technical reports, protected testimonies, videos exposing faces and voices, and official documents with seals and signatures that could not be easily denied. The response was a wave of confusion and public outrage, but also silent intimidation. The tentacles of the network tried to organize their defense quickly and with hidden violence. And then I understood that the case that had started as a routine forensic matter had become a living testimony of resistance and danger. Nevertheless, despite fear and uncertainty, there were moments of humanity that remained etched forever. The youngest daughter, when I learned she was under protection, sent me a handwritten note that said, "Thank you for believing us when no one else would." That simple, brief phrase held the weight of everything we were facing. It was the voice of someone who had lost her father, yes, but also the voice of those who dare to challenge the silences imposed by those who fear change. That human contact, real and tangible, lightened the weight of solitude I so often felt in that battle. The last fragments I could get from the recovered audio still echo in my memory, especially because they revealed plans to expand the corrupt system to other areas, even with aspirations to guarantee impunity in other levels of the state. That revelation reaffirmed the idea that this was not just a judicial case or a dark chapter, but part of a model replicated in many places under different forms. Understanding this means accepting that the struggle is long, that justice can be elusive, but also that every act of resistance counts. The path is not risk-free, but there is no turning back. When I put an end to that phase of the investigation, I did not feel closure, but rather a renewed commitment. The gravity of what was discovered demands constant vigilance and an awakened community. The bodies that until then had only whispered their truth. Thanks to every revealed detail and the courage of those who refused to stay silent, managed to make that truth begin to resonate loudly, awakening consciences and calling to action. Often, I wonder what that case would have been like if I had ignored that tiny speck of dust, that receiver that seemed so insignificant. Now I know that in every detail, no matter how small, there's a vital story to tell, and I will not rest until those voices find justice. I know, however, that darkness does not dissipate easily. There will always be those who try to silence, who camouflage reality and build walls to hide what terrifies the established power. But I also know that the invisible threads that now support the truth are strong, because they are woven with courage, patience, and a deep certainty that no lie can stand upright when the light of honesty shines. That is why I keep listening, investigating, narrating. Because the story does not end with a body. The story is a constant struggle to make visible what others want buried. My most astonishing forensic case was not just discovering a death that seemed ordinary. It was discovering how death itself can be a key to open doors that no one wants opened, and how, despite everything, there exists a greater power, the one residing the truth told with detail, rigor, and courage. Thus, with every word I write and every story I share, I hope to plant that seed so that someday justice really will not be a rare act reserved for a few, but a path all of us can walk without fear. Because, deep down, that tiny receiver and that barely visible speck of dust taught me something fundamental. No matter how silent the world may seem, there's always a voice waiting to be heard, a voice that once ignited does not easily go out. The nights grew longer and my eyes heavier. Each visit to the streets I once walked without suspicion revealed new layers of macabre machinery operating with chilling precision. Sometimes, walking through those neighborhoods waving the night, I felt watched, as if the city itself whispered warnings I shouldn't ignore. The weight of that small speck of dust, an apparently insignificant mote, had grown into a dark beacon illuminating secrets no one wanted to relive. I vividly remember one afternoon when I approached an almost ruined bar, a place that had been the site of clandestine meetings, and which, according to some neighbors, closed abruptly just a few months ago. The place had a rusty door and boarded-up windows that barely let in any light. When I asked those who allowed me near, I received evasive glances and sighs thick with fear or resignation. An elderly man, with a trembling voice, mentioned the person whose influence seemed to have woven the web we were now trying to unravel. It was not just someone with decision-making power, but an entire machinery of silences and omissions. The wind played with the dust helmets piled on an old table, and as he spoke softly, I knew that this was another link in the chain that had to be broken. It was that same week when a call to the encrypted phone showed me another dimension of the struggle. A stranger, with a confident but fearful voice, confirmed that some internal forces were beginning to divide. He said certain sectors within that dark network were starting to lose faith in absolute impunity, aware that rising pressure could be our greatest ally. It was the first time I felt that this fight was real and salvageable, that the truth found in silences could cause cracks in seemingly impenetrable walls. But I also understood that hope had to be handled carefully, because trust can break as quickly as it forms. Each day, this hesitation between progress and setback intensified. The victim, who initially seemed just a body without history, revealed themselves as a symbol, a beacon lit in a night that seemed endless. They had written in invisible ink on the cracks of their life a map for those who knew where to look, marks, dates, people, codes. Thanks to interviews with their closest circle, I discovered they were never alone in their efforts to tell the truth. Anonymous helpers, silent voices, attentive to the slightest sign that could expose the injustice hidden beneath daily routine. One afternoon, while reviewing files in the office, an unmarked envelope appeared in my mailbox. Without closing the door or alarming anyone, I opened it slowly and found inside old photos, handwritten notes, and a small paper with a cryptic message. Dust does not lie, neither does man. Look where the clock stopped. The illusion led me directly to an abandoned train station, a place few visited and that seemed frozen in time, covered by the murmur of the wind and sticky humidity. There, hours later, among graffiti and torn posters, I found a small false compartment in a metal box, hidden to naked eye but revealing for those who knew what to search for. Inside lay key documents, evidence connecting the network to other unpunished cases that had been closed as accidents or suicides without further review. Tension became inevitable. It was not just another investigation. It was a minefield where every step required precision and courage. When I shared that discovery with my allies in a clandestine meeting, the atmosphere electrified. Fear was present, yes, but determination grew with each testimony and each new piece of data. We knew exposing those characters involved not only legal risks but physical ones. However, the goal remained clear: to dismantle that dark machinery, deliver justice to those who could no longer speak, and allow their voices to resonate beyond imposed silence. One of the hardest moments came when I received a veiled warning, in the form of an anonymous letter, written in red ink and chopped words, a direct demonstration that the battle had ceased to be just an intellectual fight. "Stop searching or you'll regret it," it said. I didn't think about hiding it or backing down. On the contrary, I felt the flame of responsibility ignite even more. I knew the line between justice and danger was narrowing, but also that fear could only become motivation to be more careful and clever. The more we opened the shell of lies, the more we noticed some walls began to tremble. There was an occasion when a key witness, who had remained hidden for years, broke their silence. They recounted in detail how the victim had tried to expose irregularities, facing increasingly serious consequences. Their words bore the weight of truth and the echo of suffering, arriving at a critical moment. That statement not only strengthened our case, but also reminded us that behind every file and every piece of data were real, brave, and vulnerable people. The network tried to counterattack with smear campaigns and manipulated leaks, a maneuver designed to divert attention and sow doubt. But every attempt was an opportunity to demonstrate the strength of our alliance and the quality of the evidence. I learned that in these kinds of cases, patience is as vital as urgency because the truth, although hidden, always finds a way to come to light, even if it does so drop by drop. A new impulse came when various international media began to show interest. This increased pressure on those who wanted the story to vanish and, at the same time, generated a chain of solidarity that protected us. The unity between brave journalists, activists, and judicial figures made it possible to build an even broader network that complicated the dark moves of the corrupt network. It was a chess game where every move had to be measured carefully, because one wrong decision could turn our advantage into defeat. In that tense scenario, an unexpected visit changed everything. A low-ranking former official, hidden behind a pseudonym, came forward with new evidence, internal documents proving the systematic will to hide crimes. Their words, though hesitant, added a new chapter. They confirmed the extent of the scheme and revealed the multiple levels of complicity. However, they also warned us about infiltrators within our own circle, putting the security of the information and the lives of those involved in the struggle at risk. The challenge of trusting and protecting became even more complicated. I couldn't let my guard down for a moment. Meetings became more rigorous, communications more encrypted, and paranoia, although exhausting, indispensable. Living with the constant feeling that someone might be behind the door or shadow in the hallway became an inevitable part of the process. But despite that fear, the conviction remained intact. This was not just a case. It was a movement toward real change, a collective awakening seeking to transform that vicious circle of impunity. Remembering those days, I also relived images of small but powerful gestures: the silent solidarity of a neighbor who offered me refuge, the coded message of a hopeful journalist, the trembling hand of the youngest daughter when she gave me a photograph of her father. All this was fuel to keep going, to resist even when the burden seemed unbearable. Because justice does not always come wrapped in heroic acts, but in human details that uphold the truth when everything seems lost. Time passed, and each new finding increased the responsibility to protect what was discovered so it would not fade under pressure. That's why we implemented increasingly sophisticated methods, guarding every word and every step. It was like a delicate balance between the desire to show the truth and the need to preserve lives. The line between transparency and discretion grew ever more blurred, but the purpose never ceased to be clear. These voices deserve to be heard, and their stories told with rigor and respect. One night, while reviewing one of the found devices, I discovered an almost lost file, a recording that had not been caught in the first analysis. On that tape, the victim's voice spoke clearly, mentioning names, dates, and places. It was a direct testimony, a silent confession desperately trying to come to light. Hearing those words, so human and brave, confirmed that we were treading on fundamental ground. It was an invitation to move forward, not to fear the darkness that might appear. I knew, without a doubt, that this was not the end. It was just another chapter in a longer story that who knows how many generations would bear on their shoulders. I thought about future investigations, those who would take over, the need to form even stronger and broader networks, so those voices would never be silenced again. The death of that man had ignited a spark, and that spark, though fragile, had the power to dismantle labyrinths and break down walls. It was at that moment I understood something deeper. Seeking justice was not enough through documents, bodies, and evidence alone. That justice needed collective commitment, the awakening of a society that did not look away, willing to listen to small signals, the imperceptible dust motes that hide whispers too important. That's why every publication, every shared story, every revealed detail was an open call to awareness and action. The road ahead was uncertain, dangerous, demanding, but above all, full of meaning. That case, which at first seemed just another file, became living proof that death is sometimes not the end but the door to necessary change. When I think of that barely visible stain and the silent receptor no one anticipated, I cannot help but feel there was a message bigger than any obstacle. That truth, though small, has an unstoppable force when it finds someone willing to listen. So, with the same calm imposed by the careful reading of a death scene, I remain attentive to every detail, every whisper, every shadow crossing the border between silence and revelation, because I know that in that balance lies the key for justice to stop being illusion and become something tangible, accessible. And although darkness persists and the struggle continues, there's a firm conviction that accompanies me. As long as there's a voice that refuses to be silenced, there will always be hope for those seeking truth and justice. Just when I thought we had reached the limit, that the network was beginning to unravel like an old worn-out fabric, something unexpected shook our certainties. It was at dawn when the silence seemed denser than ever, when an anonymous message broke into my encrypted phone. It had no sender, no signature, only a few lines full of warning and certainty. What you seek isn't where you look. Answers hurt, but the truth hurts more. It handed me several coordinates, a blurry map that no one else seemed to notice, a sort of hideout that didn't appear in official files or public descriptions, a place that, due to its abandonment, lent itself to hiding secrets without witnesses. That night, weighed down by fresh information and latent adrenaline, I decided to go. It wasn't the first time I risked entering forgotten sites, but a different feeling accompanied me, a mixture of unease and anticipation that reminded me why we had started this fight. The metallic train rattling at the abandoned station sounded like a distant heartbeat, an echo from times when corruption hadn't yet darkened so many lives. It was there, among the scent of rust and dampness, that I spotted signs that had gone unnoticed until that moment. Subtle marks on the wall, soaked papers carelessly stacked, and a small box hidden under a loose floorboard. Opening that box was like unearthing a cursed treasure. Documents signed with names that resonated within the state apparatus, photographs recording clandestine meetings, and correspondence outlining strategies of control and silence. There were even lists with crossed-out names, dates, and suspicious amounts. It was a definitive proof we needed to show that this was not an isolated case, but an extensive and planned web, a spider web of complicities culminating in the murder of that man. That moment was one of the most intense of the entire investigation, because the evidence raised the stakes, increased the danger, but also hope. When I left, I knew every subsequent step had to be even more protected. I couldn't afford carelessness, nor let that information fall into the wrong hands. The game was getting complicated. The forces at play didn't want to lose the board or the pieces. That's why, when the next day I met with my allies in a safe place, I shared every detail with the clarity and respect it deserved. The knowing looks and tension-filled pauses made clear that we all understood we were facing a crucial moment. From then on, it was decided to involve human rights organizations and trusted journalists to avoid isolation and make media pressure a shield against any silencing attempts. But progress wasn't linear. Almost as soon as some fragments of the investigation were released, responses came quickly. There were blatant attempts to discredit us, with false statements and fear campaigns aimed at painting the victim as a shady character and those defending him as irresponsible or naive. However, popular support and the strength of the documents prevented those maneuvers from succeeding. It was during those days that I realized that the truth, however uncomfortable, finds and resists a force that cannot be underestimated. I also realized that citizen support was as vital as tangible evidence, because they were the ones who could break the vicious circle of fear and indifference. Pressure also reached the judicial sphere, where some judges showed doubt, and others rushed to close files, perhaps drawn by old commitments or hidden fears. Secret meetings and dark corridors of the courts became battlegrounds where patience and cunning had to overcome years of impunity. In those encounters, with documents spread on tables and low voices, strategies were drawn to make progress without endangering the lives of those providing crucial information. International collaboration was decisive to amplify pressure, and as that support network strengthened, some pieces began to move, even if slowly. Amid all this turmoil, I received an unexpected visit. It was a woman, almost a shadow among shadows, who came to my house seeking not to be seen. She held a thick folder with more evidence, clandestinely recorded videos, audios, and records showing brutality with which the network acted, not only against those who opposed them, but also toward entire families. Her story was heartbreaking, full of pauses and looks that spoke of fear and dignity. That encounter made me see clearly that behind every investigation were broken lives, open wounds, and that we, those seeking justice, had to embrace those stories and protect them. The following weeks were a succession of advances and setbacks, where every small achievement was celebrated almost silently because the danger never disappeared. Receiving news that one of the ringleaders had been arrested was like a ray of sun after a relentless storm. But at the same time, we knew reprisals, enforced silences, and threats would follow that arrest. One of those nights, while reviewing the latest reports, I heard a strange noise at the front door. Nothing unusual in appearance, but intuition warned me I was not alone. It was a prolonged moment where every second seemed to weigh like an eternity until the shadow disappeared, leaving me with a clear feeling that the battle still had at least one invisible hand trying to stop us. Months turned into a labyrinth of secret meetings, coded messages, and constant analysis demanding from me and the entire team not only scientific precision, but also mental strength tested at every step. We discovered how the network operated not only through direct violence, but with silent complicities. Officials, businessmen, police, even bureaucrats who looked the other way or actively participated in cover-ups. It was a painful learning experience because dismantling that machinery was like trying to disarm a clock without breaking a key piece, understanding that every gear made of fear and interest was ready to resist. Even amid darkness, there were unexpected moments of light that pushed the cause forward. A young volunteer, who had followed the case from the beginning thanks to an article he came across almost by chance, decided to support the investigation with IT tools and digital analysis. His contribution made it possible to discover invisible connections in the data, links we hadn't detected with traditional methods. That collaboration, initially something I hesitated to accept due to his unknown profile, ended up being crucial to monitor movements and anticipate possible sabotage maneuvers. It was a vivid reminder that justice could also find allies in unexpected places. Later, in one of the most revealing interviews, a witness who had remained silent for years, fearful of reprisals, agreed to tell me a story that challenged many previous assumptions. She recounted how the victim had been part of something bigger than we imagined, a group trying precisely to expose corruption from within, using discreet methods and spy-proof codes. But the corrupt machinery detected and crushed them with systematic brutality, making deaths appear as accidents and survivors disappear or change identities. Her account enriched the investigation's map, showing the real size of the puzzle and the despair of those living cornered by impunity. At this critical phase, I understood that the true enemy was not only that group but the fear embedded in society, the indifference that had allowed all this to grow in the shadows. That's why every act we carried out was a challenge to break that silence. Public exhibitions, talks with students, and meetings with affected communities. That tiny spark I had discovered in the dust stain had become a collective flame, strong and growing, capable of igniting consciences and breaking invisible chains. It was evidence that justice, beyond papers and sentences, was an act of collective courage. However, the task did not get easier. Threats also escalated in intensity and subtlety. When we thought everything was heading toward an end, a new complication arose. An infiltrator within our circle began giving clues to the network. His ability to anticipate our moves endangered not only the information, but also the lives of several active members in the cause. That betrayal hid familiar faces and forced us to review every trust and procedure to keep the investigation's integrity intact. It was a hard blow, but strengthened even more our conviction that the truth had to come out, no matter the cost. The days when we had to analyze every piece of information became rituals of intense tension. There was no room for errors while decoding messages and cross-checking testimonies. Amid those endless shifts, I constantly remembered the body of that victim. The beginning of everything that today had led us to look more closely, to listen carefully to those specks of dust that seemed harmless. It was impossible to forget that every detail, every foreign sigh, was a form of resistance against the attempt to erase history once and for all. And yet, when the case seemed destined to become an endless struggle, a new revelation shook the foundations of the entire investigation. Thanks to a contact abroad who connected with exiles and activists, we obtained documents proving international connections used to launder money and cover up crimes. It was confirmation that the web didn't operate only within one country's borders, but was part of a global network that disregarded borders and rights. That discovery opened a powerful door, allowing us to request international cooperation and multiply surveillance over suspicious movements. While all this was happening, the victim began to seem less like a corpse and more like a living symbol, a kind of beacon illuminating what no one dared to face. His torn story, told in whispers, had woven a network of hope, a solid promise driving others to join and rise up. It was at this point that I understood a truth I had suspected from the beginning. The strength of the small can dismantle the largest shadows, and sometimes justice lies in what at first seems invisible or insignificant. I don't know what will happen in the future of this investigation. Much remains to be unraveled, and the risk, though huge, does not intimidate those of us who decide to confront it. But if I've learned anything in these months of tireless struggle, it is that there is no darkness so dense that it can extinguish the light of truth when there is a soul and will willing to uphold it. That tiny stain, that dust no one saw coming, taught us that in the faintest sign may lie the key to change everything. I close this part of the journey with the certainty that this is not just another case, but a call to constant vigilance, to silent resistance, to tireless conviction. Because maybe the greatest lesson being a forensic doctor taught me wasn't just a cold analysis of a body, but learning to listen to those tiny details, those quiet voices, and understand that in them lies the true power of justice. And although the night is still long and shadows insist on lurking, I know that as long as those voices keep speaking, we will never be alone in this battle. What came next was a silent parade of sleepless nights and mornings that seemed to bring no answers, only more questions that bit relentlessly. Every new document, every video, every clandestine conversation opened a door, but also triggered an invisible defense mechanism, a network of shadows that seemed to extend in all directions. It was as if every step we took awakened something dormant, a giant that did not want to be disturbed, showing its sharp fawn with every attempt to advance. We found clues that vanished just when we thought we had them secured, or testimonies that broke under the weight of fear. But the most unsettling thing was that constant feeling of being watched, that at every move, someone was waiting in ambush, monitoring our limits and pushing us back. One day, while analyzing certain intercepted phone calls and monitoring suspicious movements around my house, I received an alert from my team. They had detected a clandestine meeting in a little frequented bar downtown. It wasn't the first time we tracked such encounters, but this time it felt different. There was nervousness in the messages, something that didn't fit. I decided to proceed with caution, contacting the young volunteer who had become an invaluable ally in the digital area. His analysis revealed that the interlocutors used coded language and references that only someone very close to the network could understand. I realized then that we had touched a deep nerve, that perhaps we were about to uncover not only the internal structure, but also the mechanism that kept everything protected from within. I approached the place in the twilight, my pulse racing, aware that this was one of those moments when a decision could mean the difference between moving forward or disappearing into oblivion. From outside, the bar looked as opaque as ever, but inside, behind double-locked doors, secrets were woven that could change the course of the investigation. Thanks to new techniques we had implemented in careful collaboration with local journalists and activists, we managed to infiltrate recordings showing conversations discussing tactics to sow doubt about the legitimacy of our investigation, and, even more worrying, about how to prepare an operation to silence those who were too close to the truth. It was a hard blow, but it did not defeat our spirit. On the contrary, it made us understand that we were facing an enemy who used not only fear and violence, but also disinformation and media manipulation. This forced us to redouble efforts in disseminating verified information, strengthening social support networks, and creating systems to protect sources and evidence. I felt constantly on edge, the thin line between safety and risk becoming more fragile, but also embraced by the certainty that giving up was not an option. On one of those days when routine seemed to devour every last trace of hope, something happened that marked me forever. I received a call on the encrypted phone. A broken voice, barely audible, repeated a phrase that resonated in my memory with unusual force. The truth lies in the things least expected, in the invisible cracks of the system. That voice belonged to a former official who, after years of silence and fear, decided to step forward to reveal details we never would have imagined. The documents he provided not only detailed dark financial maneuvers and lists of implicated people, but also entries and exits of the government building whose existence did not appear on official blueprints. It was a bunker hidden in the heart of the city, a place designed to cover the darkest secrets under layers of bureaucracy and false anonymity. That night, I couldn't sleep. I imagined that place, its empty hallways, the muffled voices that once echoed within its walls. I was clear that there we would find a key to understand complexity of the network and, perhaps, the path to dismantle it. I convinced the team to prepare a deeper investigation, combining physical surveillance with digital analysis and testimonies, an effort that carried enormous risks, but also the opportunity to reveal the real magnitude of the evil we had to unravel. When we started that operation, nerves and adrenaline played the leading role. There was no room for mistakes. Every detail counted. Every second was crucial. We scouted the surroundings, detecting hidden cameras, analyzing schedules, and preparing a strategy that would allow us to enter without raising suspicion. The weight of responsibility was immense, but conviction remained firm. During the process, we encountered new difficulties. The building was guarded by personnel with official credentials, and the access routes were controlled with skill that left no room for improvisation. However, something in the organization's security suggested that not all involved were satisfied with what happened there, a crack we could try to exploit. Finally, after weeks of surveillance and gathering, we gained access to internal files through an unexpected source. A worker who, tired of corruption and silence, decided to help us from the shadows. The documents were more shocking than we had imagined. They contained records of secret meetings, names linked to high-ranking officials, and irrefutable evidence of agreements to manipulate judicial processes, assign fraudulent contracts, and eliminate any internal threats. But what unsettled me the most was discovering a list where the victim's name appeared, not as a mere witness or part of the network, but as someone who had decided to break away from everything and expose themselves directly. I knew then that their death had not been a coincidence or accident, but a sacrifice silenced with violence. That revelation closed one chapter and opened another. The certainty that we were facing something that transcended one person, a network operating with the impunity granted by systemic complicity. It forced us to expose not only the murder, but the entire climate of corruption and fear that allowed other bodies to be left behind, forgotten. The memory of that elderly man, who at first seemed like just another case, took on a different meaning. It was an urgent call echoing through time, a warning of what could happen if we gave up the pursuit of justice. I do not exaggerate when I say that stage was the most stormy of my career, and perhaps the most human. It was when I understood that forensic work is not limited to examining corpses, but involves listening to silent voices, following hidden trails, and resisting a system that constantly puts up barriers. I knew justice is not an abstract concept nor a cold sentence, but a daily act of courage and commitment, often solitary but necessary. The truth, I discover with greater clarity than ever, has relentless patience and a force that can emerge from the smallest things, like that speck of dust no one could ignore. Today, as I tell you this, I feel we are at crossroads. The road to justice is long, tortuous, but also full of unexpected and old allies returning with stories that would frighten if not for the hope they hide. The fight continues, and although the enemy lurks, so does the indestructible conviction of those who believe change is possible. Because, in the end, I understood that the light we seek is not in grand gestures nor flashy headlines, but in those small details someone took the time to notice, keep, and share. That silent truth that waits patiently, ready to be heard. And here I stop, my friend, not to close a chapter, but to open a space where every voice matters, where every story is a spark that can ignite the darkness. Because I know, with a certainty born from experience and commitment, that while there are those who listen to the small signs, while there are eyes attentive to the dust that falls invisible, no shadow will be eternal. The struggle is hard, the night long, but the truth, with all its weight and hidden shine, always finds a way to shine. That is our legacy and our hope. And so, without more, the story goes on.